Hello, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. A very, very warm welcome to the third in our Sir Martin Gilbert Churchill Conversation series. I am Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London and also the Academic Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. And we're really delighted to be hosting this series in partnership with the International Churchill Society and the Churchill Archives Centre. The conversations are a series of virtual events in which we're showcasing across a few weeks new scholarship and perspectives on the life and legacy of Sir Winston Churchill. We're presenting the series in honor of the late historian Sir Martin Gilbert, who was, of course, Winston Churchill's official biographer. And I should clarify that I bear no relation to Sir Martin, although we do unsurprisingly get that question quite a lot. In addition to completing the final 6 of 8 volumes of Churchill's life, Sir Martin also compiled and edited a series of documents known as the companion volumes, as well as 17 further Churchill-related books and several dozen more influential and very widely read accounts of the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, Israel, and the modern Jewish experience. Sir Martin was not only a master chronicler of the modern world, but really had a remarkable ability to bring history alive to his audiences. And so the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was recently established in his memory, has as its primary aim to bring the finest historical research to a really broad non-academic public and make history accessible and exciting. We offer a really wide program of events across the year on the subject Sir Martin spent his life exploring. So please do join our mailing list. I see Justin's already put a link in the chat so that we can let you know about forthcoming events. I also want to extend a very warm welcome to Sir Martin's widow, Lady Esther Gilbert, who is joining us today. Justin will also put a link in the chat to her website. In fact, I see that he's put that there as well, where you can find a great deal more information about Sir Martin's life and work. Today, the subject of our conversation is Churchill's Europe, and it's a real privilege to have with us Richard Toye and Felix Klos to engage first in discussion with one another and then with you, our audience. So we'll allow about 30 to 40 minutes for their initial discussion, and after that, we'll open up for questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A function, and you can feel free to submit your questions throughout the talk. And we will convey them to the speakers afterwards. As we've done in the previous 2 events, we'll also be giving away a copy of Richard's book, one of Richard's books, as well as one of Felix's books for the 2 best questions that we receive. And I will hand over now to Alan Packwood, who is the director of the Churchill Archives Centre, to introduce our speakers. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you so much, Shirley. So as you've just heard, our subject tonight is Churchill's Europe. A topic in which there has, unsurprisingly, been a lot of interest in the last few years because of Brexit. And of course, during the Brexit debate, Churchill was presented as both a Brexiteer and as a Remainer, simultaneously as the champion of British parliamentary sovereignty and independence, and as one of the founders of the post-war European movement. Churchill spoke at Zurich in September 1946 about the importance of creating a United States of Europe. He served as honorary president at a Congress of Europe at The Hague in 1948, and he was a keynote speaker at the First Council of Europe in May 1949. And looking at the issues through a contemporary lens, these 2 versions of Churchill as Brexiteer and Remainer might seem contradictory and irreconcilable. But I hope that one of the constant themes of this series, and of course one of the constants of Sir Martin's own work, is that you have to see Churchill's views and actions in their proper context, in the context of their time and place. So what I'm hoping we can do this evening is to go beyond the crude Brexit headlines, though we might want to start by looking at some of them, and to look in detail at what Churchill believed about European unity, to see whether his views changed over time, and to explore the mindset and thinking that underpinned his approach. One issue which I'm sure we will cover, and which has become rather fundamental to this whole debate, is the question of where Churchill saw Britain's role. Did he see it as an external guarantor of European stability, or did he see Britain as playing a leading role in the new European project? or is actually the truth somewhere between the two? And again, we might ask whether this view changed over time. Because with Churchill, there is a tendency to assume constancy. But he was a politician responding to changing political realities. This is the man who said, in the course of my life, I've often had to eat my words, and I must confess that I have always found them a wholesome diet. So helping us to untangle this complex issue, we have two expert panelists, both joining us from Europe. Firstly, and I will ask them if they can join me on the screen now. Firstly, from the Netherlands, I'm delighted that we have Felix Klos. Felix is an American-Dutch historian, political scientist, and author. He was educated at Lincoln College in the University of Oxford and at Middlebury College in Vermont. His academic work has focused on European integration, and in particular, he is the author of two works, Churchill on Europe, the untold story of Churchill's European project, and then Churchill's Last Stand. And like Churchill, Felix has combined his writing with active politics and is currently a campaigner and speechwriter for the Democrat 66 Party in the Netherlands. Our second panelist is Professor Richard Toye, Professor of Modern History at the University of Exeter. He's published 19 books and is an expert on the life, career, and reputation of Winston Churchill. In 2007, he won the Times Higher Education Young Academic Author of the Year Award for his book, Lloyd George and Churchill, Rivals for Greatness. And his most recent monograph, Winston Churchill, A Life in the News, explores Churchill's journalism, his media image, and his efforts to control it, and the reception of news about him by ordinary readers and viewers. And Richard's other notable works on Churchill, including the self-explanatory Churchill's Empire and The Roar of the Lion, which looks in detail at the creation and reception of Churchill's speeches. And then with others, Richard has edited The Churchill Myths, which looks at how Churchill's name has been used since his death, including in the Brexit debate. So let's get started, and do start those questions coming through the Q&A function. And I think perhaps we should start this by getting Brexit out of the way, in a way. So Felix, perhaps we can start with you. Your own research on this subject, your writing of these books took place against the backdrop of the Brexit campaign and referendum. What led you to the subject of Churchill and Europe? And how do you feel about the way Churchill's views were being presented in the political sphere and in the press at the time you were writing?
Well, to start with the first question, and thank you so much for having me here and for your very kind introductory notes and for having us here, Alan. It's wonderful to be with you always. I really started writing this book out of curiosity, and it was my academic work that led me to it. My academic work was actually mostly focused on the first years of European integration and the British role in whether or not to accede to the Schuman Plan, which was really the foundation of the European Union as we know it. And what I found out, and many have before me, is that Churchill played a significant role in the British debate on this question, in the House of Commons, but also outside of it. But then what really struck me was that no one had written an actual book on this subject. There was one PhD thesis on the subject. There were several chapters. There were a couple of journalistic articles and academic articles, but not a consistent book on the body of Churchill's thinking regarding Europe. And this is really what brought me to write this book. And it was a unique moment in time, especially because it was 2015 and we were, right leading up to the European referendum. So it was a good time for me to publish this book as well. I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Okay. And as you were writing it, as you were doing the research, how did your own research, how did you find that compared with the way the debate was taking place and the sort of standard of debate that you were seeing in the political arena and in the press?
Well, what struck me was that mostly Boris Johnson was sort of cladding himself in Churchill's mantle and taking up his legacy and presenting him as a modern day Churchill, and then also twisting his European views to suit him. He would often speak about the ways in which Churchill was against British participation in a European federation, which was right to some extent, but we'll get into this later, but left out the parts that were uncomfortable for him. On the other side of the argument, there were people like Nicholas Soames, Churchill's grandson, who were claiming Churchill for themselves. And I think to some extent they were right, but they were also leaving out some of the parts that were uncomfortable to them. So it's an easy, well, let me say this. I also work in politics, and it's easy to blame politicians for using history or abusing history, if you will. But the standard of debate, especially in the British press, wasn't very high on this, and I think we probably should have done better. I know there was a group called Historians for Britain in Europe, and I was impressed with them, and I wasn't so much impressed with the historians arguing for out or Brexit.
Okay, well, Richard, let me bring you in. So why do you feel it was so important for both sides, Brexiteers and Remainers, to cite Churchill in the debate? Why was there a need to bring him into this? And what does that perhaps tell us about the way Churchill is seen today? And what does it tell us about Britain today, I suppose?
Well, I think the simple answer is that he's an iconic figure. And I think we have a slide which we might share, which is a UKIP poster from 2009, which I think illustrates the point quite nicely. And here, what we see is Churchill's image being used. It's obviously a very powerful and familiar image. But what's interesting is that if you look at the text of the poster, then it makes makes a number of statements or sort of policy statements. What it doesn't do is explicitly say, and Churchill would have agreed with us. It rather makes that argument. Clearly, one is intended to reach the conclusion that Churchill would have agreed with this position, but this is achieved simply by the use of the association of his image with these ideas, rather than there being a sort of complex debate or the citation of his specific arguments. Now, I think we can sort of lose the slide at this point, but I think that what one actually saw is that the debate did operate at a number of different levels, and that Boris Johnson, although I agree with Felix's critique, it was actually to some extent, he was making arguments which were based on things which Churchill had actually said. And so there is if you look at his book in 2014, there is a chapter on Europe, and it sort of does make the case that Churchill was probably was not particularly European enthusiastic. But at the end, he does say, well, the oracle is dumb. We can't conclude from what Churchill said back in the 1940s about what we ought to do today. Now, I think he said that because at the point that he wrote that, he himself was actually sitting on the fence about where he was going to come in the European debate. But in a sense, there are sort of the people who trade quotations, and it's quite easy to do to sort of locate quotations which support both sides. And there is the sort of the emotive use of Churchill through the kind of the iconography, if you like. Now, I think that from the point of view of political persuasion, it's the iconography which is rather more effective, rather than expecting voters to get into these what are very complex questions about exactly what Churchill did think. Now, to me, I don't find the use which is made by either side particularly satisfactory, because it seems to me to be, apart from anything, based on a rather strange idea that if Churchill was in favor of something, you should be in favor of it, and if he was against something, you should be against it. Well, it may well be. I think he did have many interesting and important things to say about Europe, but I don't think, we kind of need to think for ourselves. We need to not just make our decision on the basis of what Churchill said many years ago. So I think the other interesting dimension of this is that it's not just British people who make use of Churchill in the debate. And Barroso, when he was president of the European Commission, for example, Guy Verhofstadt, for example, of examples of European politicians who've tried to win over people in Britain by making use of the memory of Churchill as a strong pro-European, which I think was well intended, but not necessarily always convincing in terms of the detail. And furthermore, I think that it can be, I think that sometimes the Remain side have thought that saying that Churchill was a pro-European was a kind of trump card, which would manage to persuade Brexiters to change their minds. And I think that this, well, I mean, clearly didn't work. I mean, maybe it did shore up the Remain vote to some extent. We can't necessarily say this was a totally failed tactic. But I think there is the risk that when Guy Verhofstadt stands up in the European Parliament and starts quoting Churchill, then actually it alienates some of the people that he's trying to win over rather than winning them over.
Okay. Felix, do you want to come back on that at all?
Yeah, sure. I think I agree with that last point that Guy Verhofstadt using Churchill's legacy would actually alienate some British voters. But I would add to that some of the European use of Churchill is not actually meant for a British consumer market. And that the founding documents of the European Union, which are very much subject of historical twists, historical argument, and are still up for debate, do actually necessarily involve discussing the legacy of Winston Churchill. And this would also, I think, correspond with his own view of history and the way that he viewed history in the late 1940s, when he would often ask in speeches to European audiences and British audiences alike, is the only lesson of history that mankind is unteachable? And this is from a speech in 1947. And he was traveling Europe with that question because he wanted people to use history as a mechanism of learning. And his lesson from half a century of nationalist wars was that small European nations, which I think in his thinking in the late 1940s, but we'll get into this a little bit later, also included Britain, had not only a need to cooperate, but actually to integrate in order to stabilize. And that's a lesson from history that I think is worth drawing. Now, I fully agree with Richard that we need to think for ourselves, that it's not just Winston Churchill that should decide for us what to vote in a national referendum. That's not at all the point that I'd like to make. But the point that I do like to make is that Winston Churchill is a figure of national importance in Britain, is a figure of European importance on the continent, and a figure of world importance overseas. And to speak about his historical legacy in the way that he would have wanted us to, I think is valuable and necessary, especially when you have a political debate.
Okay, well, I think the two of you have set us up perfectly. What we want to try and do now, I think, is to move beyond the iconography, to move beyond the sort of headline quotations, and try and get into some of that historical nuance that you've just been talking about. So let's start. And in 1930, Churchill wrote an article called The United States of Europe. And of course, he was deliberately using terminology that had been developed by others, people like Count Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, who had long been advocating greater European Union, primarily, I think, as an alternative to and defense against both communism and nationalism. And it seems to me, particularly in the light of the sort of Great Depression, that in this article in 1930, Churchill was promoting an economic union that would remove barriers to trade so as to increase prosperity and to lessen national tensions and rivalries. But he is quite clear in his text at this point on the position of Britain, writing that we are with Europe, but not of it. We are linked, but not comprised. Felix, now I think you would argue that this was a starting point for Churchill in 1930, but that his views on European unity and on Britain's role do change over time, and particularly change during those post-war years, perhaps between 1946 and 1949. So do you want to take us quickly through how you see Churchill's roles adapting and evolving?
Sure. So this would be the starting point, but actually, Alan, you're being a little bit too modest right now, because you've unearthed a document that he read from 1904, which I think was a German military officer, right, that had sent him a report on the necessity of building a United States of Europe. But he had the temerity to suggest, if I'm right, that it should be France and Britain building it together, not necessarily France and Germany. What Churchill came to think in the 1930s is, in fact, you were right to say this, that economic union was necessary to strengthen Europe's economy, and that Britain should just be a guarantor or a sponsor and a friend of this new peace in Europe and this new sense of economic dynamism. Of course, this was a time when the British Empire was still very much flourishing and still very much, and Richard will know much more about this than I do, but was still much more on the minds of people as a sort of world power. I think the war indelibly created a need for union that Churchill didn't foresee in the 1930s. So yes, he was saying, I'm all in favor of a United States of Europe, which was a revolutionary thought at the time, but he was jumping on a bandwagon of sort of pan-European thinkers in the 1920s and 30s. When the Second World War changes everything. And in 1940, Winston Churchill proposes joining into a super state with France in order to save France for the war and in a war effort, and to share passports and a foreign policy and a currency. And of course, this doesn't come about because France falls. Then in 1942, Churchill writes to Anthony Eden that he wants to create a Council of Europe after the war, which was very much out of the question at the time. But Churchill was already thinking ahead in 1942 to what the world should look like after the war was won. And then after 1945, he starts to act on this thought. So he starts to travel Europe, as you say, in 1946 in Zurich, 1947 in Britain, 1948 in The Hague, 1949 in Strasbourg. And he starts to talk about the need to unite Europe, but then also he starts to include Britain as a possible partner in this project, and in fact, not only a partner, as a leading partner in this project. Then, just to sort of finish this chronology, he returns back to power in 1951 and doesn't do a thing for Britain to join what was then the European Coal and Steel Community, which was a great tragedy for many Europeans who thought he would take Britain into what was then a sort of embryonic European Union. He doesn't do a thing, of course, because now the French and the Germans are building this into a full-fledged federation. And he never thought that the British Commonwealth and Empire were compatible with a federation at that time.
Okay. Well, Richard, this seems a good moment to bring you in on this. I mean, how would you see the context in which Churchill is operating in this immediate post-war period? How does his campaign for European unity sit alongside and link to his sort of wider personal and political agenda? And how do we sort of reconcile it with what's happening in British domestic politics and international relations?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that we can go back actually before the 1930s to sort of see the development of his worldview. As you mentioned, there have been many uses before Churchill of the term United States of Europe, but I think I would emphasize that what he's trying to recreate, if you like, in 1945 to 1951 is, it's to some extent the lost world of pre-1914 Europe. And he had traveled in Europe as a young man. He'd made a journey to Switzerland, for example, with friends. And what you see in those accounts is the sort of the ease with which, of course, he was a privileged person with a significant amount of money, but nevertheless, the ease with which it was possible, if you had those resources, to travel across Europe and to communicate and to not necessarily need a passport, for example. And you can see the ways in which his parents are also in another part of Europe, and the letters go backwards and forwards quite quickly. Of course, Felix quite rightly emphasized the importance of World War II, but we should also emphasize the importance of World War I, so that we see that this seemingly harmonious and peaceful Europe has been torn apart. Churchill has direct experience of that, seeing that on the Western Front. And therefore, the barriers to trade and sort of intercommunication which emerge during the interwar period are things which are sort of destroying, if you like, the what he sees as something of the golden age. And therefore, to think about him in 1945 to 1946 is really thinking, well, how can we recreate what I see as valuable? He didn't just enjoy travel; he saw what he viewed as a civilization and the culture of Europe as being important. So that was very important. And I would also emphasize the Cold War context. Now, we can recognize, it's easy to recognize that, of course, the Cold War must have been important in 1946 when he made the speech in Europe, but to say exactly how it functioned, exactly what its importance was, is quite complicated. There are many different things going on. And what is striking about the Zurich speech, or one thing which is very striking about it, is he says, I will say something which will astonish you. And what will astonish his audience, he thinks, is his proposal for Franco-German reconciliation, really a very, very short time after the conclusion of the German occupation of France. And at a point where, as he's speaking in September 1946, the verdicts in the Nuremberg trials have not yet been handed down. So what Churchill is really saying is that he thinks that he's saying that the Nuremberg trials will kind of bring to an end the kind of the punishment phase, if you like, and then the reconciliation phase can begin. And at the same time, he's also thinking about nuclear weapons. He said he has to talk about this in a coded way. He has to talk about it in a very oblique way, but he says the time is short. And what he means by this is that this opportunity to build a United States of Europe, there is a chance to do it while the Americans still have a monopoly on nuclear weapons, and that therefore the Soviets can be reasonably be expected to be held at bay for a long time. And so, well, not for a long time, but for a period until he realizes that they will inevitably develop a nuclear weapon, and therefore the situation will change. So there's this kind of short window of opportunity that he's seeking to exploit. And of course, the Soviets in their propaganda recognize, well, they do two things. First of all, because this is actually a very old discourse going back to the 19th century, they accuse Churchill of simply recycling old ideas when he talks about a United States of Europe. And on the other hand, they accuse him of nuclear blackmail and warmongering. So there are more things that one could say about the context, but I would emphasize this lengthy history, both of other people's ideas and of Churchill's personal experience, and of the very specific circumstances of the Cold War at the point at which he was speaking.
I mean, just picking up on Felix's answer, I mean, do you think that Churchill's view of the position of Britain in Europe shifts during the 1940s? And if so, what is the reason for that?
I think it does. And I would, Felix, I would hand over to Felix to draw attention to a particular document which he uncovered in his book, which I think is very important. So maybe he could just say a little bit about this document from September 1946 before I might add some more comments.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that, Richard. I actually, I have it here. I wasn't prepared for your question, but I do have it here. So Churchill travels to Switzerland to prepare for his Zurich speech. And he goes a couple rounds with his son-in-law, Duncan Sands, about what the speech should be about. And he goes a couple rounds with the university, who were very much afraid that Churchill would upset the Russians or Swiss politicians. But to the Swiss diplomat responsible for his visit on the eve of the speech, he reveals what he is thinking about when he's talking about the British position. And he says this: I have preferred not to stress this point, the position of Britain in Europe, so as to leave to others the task of inviting us. One must not give the impression that we wish to control Europe, even though it is clear that only Great Britain is capable today of guiding her properly. Then he says, or perhaps you invite Russia first, which will refuse, and in that case, Britain will be able to join. So this is a sort of behind the scenes insight, or at least what he's telling Swiss diplomats about his speech and what he means. So I'll hand it back over to Richard, but that's the sort of the documentary background.
I think it is a very important discovery because, of course, there is a line in the speech which people who wish to claim that Churchill didn't wish for British participation will quote. So they will quote the bit where he says that Britain and other powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, should be the friends and sponsors of the new Europe, which obviously then implies that Britain won't be a member. So I think that discovering this sort of behind the scenes document is very important. However, I would say that it's striking that this isn't something which he appears to be saying consistently or repeatedly. It may be a one-off. It may be that he said it on other occasions to other people who didn't write it down and report it to their governments. But certainly this idea seems to have sort of faded away quite quickly. So I think that is probably my answer to Alan's point. Yes, it did change. And that documents which I've discovered in New York, the New York Public Library, Churchill gave a speech or had dinner with journalists from the New York Times, several of whom wrote down their own accounts. And they quite consistently say that Churchill said that Britain should not be part of a federal Europe. And one of them said that he said that Britain should not be part of a United States of Europe. Now, did he use that exact quotation or not? Maybe the balance is that he was saying, that he didn't explicitly say that and said he didn't want to be part of a federal Europe. So I think it's still possible to think that he objected to this idea of a federal Europe, yet nonetheless, what he saw as a United States of Europe did involve Britain potentially ceding some of its sovereignty. And so I think we always have to remember that we have a very strong tendency, understandably enough, to focus on what did Churchill think or what would he have thought of the EEC or the EU. What we have to remember is that what he was actually campaigning for in the late 1940s was for something equivalent to what did become the Council of Europe, which of course is institutionally separate from what became the EU. So in a way, it's a much more modest organization, but the European Convention of Human Rights is part of it, and that is a very important document. And of course, that does place limitations on sovereignty, and Churchill was in favor of it. So I think that one can say that he was in favor, of course, of Britain's participation in certain forms of European integration. But everybody naturally wants to know, well, what would he have thought of British membership of the EU in 2016? And really, I think we should remember that he was involved in this actual practical attempt to create an institution which survives today and which has its own significance.
Yeah, and interesting to sort of contrast what Churchill was saying to the Swiss with what perhaps Churchill was saying to the Americans, and maybe to think about how much of that was tactical on his part. I mean, I think, looking at the big set piece speeches that he makes in the late 1940s, I think he's often very deliberately vague or ambiguous in the wording about how far European Union should go in terms of the merging of sovereignty, or in the role that Britain should play in that united Europe. He talks specifically in a couple of those speeches about how his role is to see the big picture and to get the debate started, and how he's going to sort of leave the fine detail to others. I mean, what do you make of that vagueness? To what extent do you think it's complicated the issue in the historiography? And what do you think it tells us about Churchill's tactics and thinking? And we could go to Felix first.
Yeah, I was going to say, because this adds on to Richard's point quite nicely. I think there were, what you have to know is that there were two extremes in the making of some form of European unity in the late 1940s. And the one approach was a very detailed constitution making, which belonged to the Federalists. And there were many Federalist groups in Europe that were very much energized by Churchill's campaign to unite Europe. And on the other end of the spectrum were those who were seeking no more than sort of governmental cooperation, the kind of governmental cooperation we might see in the Council of Ministers now within the EU. So cooperation, but not integration. And Churchill was very careful to stress that he was holding the middle between those two positions. And in his language, he was very careful to use the words organic union. So he was always talking about planting a seed which might grow into a tree, which might blossom into something beautiful. And that would be my point about the Council of Europe, is that his point was not to just have the Council of Europe and have it be the Council of Europe, but his point was to establish a body of consultative European opinion in Strasbourg, which might grow into something more, but we just didn't know yet. And so I don't think Churchill ever reconciled his idea for further European unity and the necessity of it, which he definitely saw, with his position of not being a federalist constitution maker. And I think this fits very nicely into the sort of British pragmatic tradition. It fits very nicely into the Tory tradition, and it fits very nicely into the narrative, I think, of Churchill's leadership.
Okay, Richard?
Yeah, I want to endorse the point which Felix just made about the Council of Europe, perhaps only being a potential start and not the end point. I think that Churchill saw a role for sort of cultural exchange and sort of mutual interchange. Really was part of his vision. I mean, I think that in terms of the tactics, one has also to remember his domestic political situation as well. Remember, he wasn't just going around Europe making speeches. He was leader of His Majesty's opposition. And so he was potentially vulnerable to criticism from Labour, which might accuse him of sort of trying to somehow trap Britain into some kind of organization or some kind of commitment which nobody had decided on at the ballot box. And so that was part of the reason why he had to tread carefully. Part of the reason was that being in opposition gives you a certain luxury of not having to be overly precise. And also, he realized that the more precise he was, the more vulnerable he would be to being criticized on points of detail, where people sort of start squabbling about, this clause or that clause. And so I think that, from a perfectly sincere level, if you like, he thought, well, this is a better tactic to be kind of inspirational, maybe a bit grandiose, be visionary, if you like, and then wait for other people to sort out the details later, than to sort of get into all sorts of minutiae. And so that was kind of unsatisfactory to some of his followers, who sort of kept saying to him, well, what exactly do you mean by a United States of Europe? And he really wouldn't allow himself to be pinned down. But I think that what we probably should do is emphasize not only that his opinions evolved over time, but that in some sense, he may have felt kind of ambivalent or uncertain himself. So in a way, it's sort of we mustn't sort of overcomplicate things by sort of reading all these statements and trying to work out exactly what did Churchill really secretly, deeply think. I think that we can see that he was being sort of pulled in different directions, first of all by the political pressures, on the one hand of his supporters who wanted him to go kind of further and faster, on the other hand the sort of domestic political considerations that I've mentioned. But on the other hand, and I thought that Felix made a very important point earlier on when he drew attention to the offer of union between Britain and France in 1940, Churchill did like to make these big gestures. You know, he sort of talks in 1943 at Harvard about kind of Anglo-American unity in a similar way. So he does have this taste for the dramatic, and yet, you know, making what are seemingly incredibly radical and very far-reaching proposals, and yet maybe at the level of detail, when people say, well, do you want to cede this power or that power, then the more nationalist or element of him, or the person who's more concerned with domestic sovereignty, may at that point pull back and say, well, you know, I'm not absolutely sure about that. I'm not sure I want an international organization poking its fingers into Britain's affairs. So I think that he was, you know, we can, you know, why not say that in certain respects he was genuinely conflicted.
And that leads us, I think, nicely into Churchill's return as Prime Minister in 1951. Obviously, as you've just said, when he's there in opposition, it's very easy to do the big picture stuff and the dramatic speeches. When he comes back as Prime Minister in 1951, of course, there is not, as Felix pointed out earlier, really a further involvement in the United Europe movement. It stops rather abruptly. And I just wondered if you could each comment as to why you think that was. So Felix, perhaps first?
Yeah, I think there are two important points to make. One is that Europe was something, or at least the European Union, as much as it existed at that point, was something different in 1951 when he came back to office than it was in 1948 when he was presiding over the Hague Congress of Europe. Schuman and Adenauer, the sort of continental leaders of European unity, had rode Churchill's wave of Europeanism all the way to the idea of establishing a European army, a complete European political union, and of course a high authority to sort of melt together the steel and coal industries of Europe. And this, for any British politician, was not a very attractive prospect, especially because you still had to think about the responsibilities of the special relationship and sort of keeping up the Joneses with the Americans, and then holding on to the responsibilities of the Commonwealth and Empire. So Europe was something different in 1951 than it was in 1949. There's something else that I think is important too, and that's the position of Anthony Eden, Churchill's loyal foreign secretary, and of course later to become prime minister himself, who was very much against the idea of Britain joining any sort of European Union, and in Churchill's old age was more powerful, I think, over British foreign policy than he was before. So those are two sort of elements that I'd like to throw in there, and then for my final point, I think, is to say that Churchill was just busy doing other things at the time. He was concerned with the domestic economy. He was concerned with some sort of détente with Russia, going to Stalin and making a peace for the world. And his eyes weren't on Europe at the time. So those three things I think are important to look at.
Well, I think that's a very good summary to which I can't add a great deal. I think it is worth mentioning that some of his more enthusiastic pro-European supporters did develop a sort of kind of betrayal narrative, if you like, that there should have been more done after 1951. Felix, of course, points out that Churchill by this time was quite old. He was, of course, in increasingly frail and poor health as well. But even so, I'm not sure that if he'd been in much better health, then he would have suddenly taken the push which people like Violet Bonham Carter and Bob Boothby, for example, really wanted. I guess as a kind of a concluding note, you know, in the trying to work out what Churchill really thought about the EEC, which is a perfectly kind of legitimate question, I think, because it was an organization which came into being in his own lifetime in 1957, of course, when he was out of power and was even older still. You know, of course, in 1961, Britain made its first application to join, and you know, an interesting thing happens, which is that Monty goes to visit Churchill in hospital and comes out and sort of says to reporters, well, I've just had this conversation with Churchill, and he says he's against Britain joining the EEC. Now, this is very, very embarrassing for the government and potentially for Churchill himself, really. And it's not really clear whether Monty had correctly or fairly represented what he'd said. And so Churchill's advisors kind of draw up a statement which says that actually Churchill supports the application, supports the government in its application. So I think it's worth just reflecting on this ambiguity that on the one hand, it is possible to imagine that, in his old age, in a chat with Monty, that he did say something, faintly anti-EEC, which maybe Monty blew out of proportion. But on the other hand, when it actually came to taking a formal position, then the one occasion in which he actually made a sort of a formal statement about what he thought, even though it wasn't really drafted by him himself, he actually took the position that Britain should go ahead with this application. So I think that kind of sort of symbolizes really kind of the warring forces within him, some sort of belief in some strong nationalistic belief in British sovereignty. On the other hand, also this strong belief in the spiritual unity of Europe, actually, and a considerable amount of pragmatic politics, where really the last thing that he wanted to do was to embarrass the leadership of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, and if I may, what I draw attention to is also that in the 1950 debate on whether or not to join what was then a concrete proposal for European unity, of course, Churchill pleaded with the British government to go to Paris and negotiate. And he said in that debate that national sovereignty is not inviolable and that it may be resolutely diminished in order to gain peace in Europe, and that this would be the case for Britain as well. So I think you're right, Richard, to say that he was in a state of mind to cede some sort of national sovereignty in the interest of unity, and that we just don't know to what extent that national sovereignty was to be ceded and what endpoint there was to this process.
Okay, well, brilliant. Well, it won't surprise you to know we've got lots and lots of questions coming in, and some of them I think pick up on what we've just been talking about, and then that is, I think, the sort of the broader context in which Churchill was operating. And so we have, for example, a question about the relationship with the United States, and the fact that the same, just before he makes the Zurich speech, Churchill goes over to Fulton, Missouri, and makes his Iron Curtain speech, where he talks about the possibility of common citizenship with the US. So how do you reconcile his policy on the United States with his policy with Europe? I mean, that is often presented now as a sort of binary choice, but that's, I think, probably not how Churchill saw it. Richard?
Well, I was just going to say, again, I found an interesting document in New York, which seems to suggest that Churchill considered as a theme for what became the Iron Curtain speech, he considered United States of Europe as a theme. So remember, he was already spoken about this in Brussels in 1945. So that actually, although there's a fairly long hiatus from 1930 to 1945, he does start talking about the United States of Europe before the kind of the famous instance in Zurich. But also, there's evidence sort of preserved in his papers is also a magazine article which talks about the Truman administration being in favor of a United States of Europe. So I think that Churchill, in making his Zurich speech, would not have done anything which he thought was going to upset or alienate the Americans. Rather, I'm sure that he felt that he was kind of walking in step with what he believed their agenda to be. And indeed, Secretary Burns, James Burns, who made a speech in Germany very close to this time, he was going to make a reference to there being a future United States of Germany, although he kind of dropped that at the last minute. So there is evidence that these things were in sync. So I think that, sort of going back to the question about 1951, had American pressure maybe been stronger for Britain to partake in European integration at that particular moment. And there had been significant pressure, American pressure, for the Attlee government to engage in initiatives such as the European Payments Union, for example, earlier on. Then, you know, if either the Truman administration or the Eisenhower administration has shown that that is a major priority at the point where Churchill returned to power, then that might have been the game changer, which would have made him, you know, more enthusiastic after 1951.
And also, Alan, it was General Marshall who said that the Zurich speech, in fact, inspired him to set up his Marshall Help, which saved a lot of European countries from economic oblivion in the late 1940s. So there was a bit of it went both ways, the inspiration, I think, for sort of transatlantic cooperation at that time. I would also say that you need to look at what Churchill viewed as Britain's position in the world to understand what he was hoping to get out of the United States, because he necessarily saw that the US was a new global superpower, and that this new sort of unrestrained, sort of raw diamond kind of power needed to be restrained and cut and shaped by the powers of the old world, Britain. And then at the same time, that was his one circle of sort of British power in the world. The second circle was the British Commonwealth and Empire, of which Britain was still the head. And the third circle, and I think in that order actually, was Europe, in which I think Churchill wanted to play a leading part. But so the British-US relationship was at the core of his thinking on foreign policy, and would remain so, and he thought was compatible with a further integration in Europe.
I'm glad you've raised the three circles and Churchill's conception of Britain's position on the world being dependent on maintaining influence in free spheres in Europe, in the United States, and as you've just said, in Empire and Commonwealth. And we've had a question come in: what would Churchill have thought about the Commonwealth as an alternative to the EU in 2016, as some Brexiteers had argued for? Did Churchill actually make comparisons between the Commonwealth and the European project as options for British foreign policy after the Commonwealth was established in 1949 as a successor to the Empire? And I suppose it's, I mean, as we've already pointed out, it's difficult for us to say what Churchill would think now. But the question about the role of the Commonwealth is obviously a key one, Richard.
Okay, what would he have thought in 2016? Well, to try and answer the question, I mean, I think that Churchill never really got to the point of seeing these things as alternatives. And I think that by the early 1960s, there was I mean, of course, even the Macmillan government in 1961, in making the application to join the EEC, didn't see this as being an alternative. Rather, they made the case that by joining the EEC, it would strengthen the Commonwealth. And so, of course, there were people who, you know, saw this application as a way of, you know, as a kind of betrayal, if you like, of, you know, Britain's friends and kinsmen, if to use Harold Wilson's term, in the Commonwealth. But I think that Churchill probably would never, but remember that by the time that he left office in 1955, there hadn't been any African decolonization, although of course there'd been independence for India, other countries in Asia. And no doubt it was beginning to be possible to see which way the wind was blowing. And so I think that if he kind of woke up in 2016, then he would have been very probably distressed, really, about the change in the relationship, the loss of the empire, the fact that it didn't seem to be, well, you know, certainly if didn't look really like a particularly credible alternative in 1961. I think it looked like a much less credible alternative in 2016. So I think that it does become very difficult to put ourselves in his shoes and really think what would he have thought, except to say that he would have found the political landscape in 2016 very strange and alienating from a very wide variety of perspectives.
Felix?
Yeah, what we do know is that he thought the two were compatible, maintaining a Commonwealth and being a partner in the European project, whatever you want to call it. And in fact, he often said that it would be worthless to the European countries if Britain joined in any sort of cooperation or integration or union without the hinterland, the economic hinterland of the Dominions. And so this was essential to his argument for European unity. It was that the two were compatible. Now, I think Churchill himself didn't ever really speak about a European Commonwealth as an alternative to a European federation, but one of his proteges, Harold Macmillan, who Richard just mentioned, certainly did. He liked to call it a European Commonwealth and a much sort of looser arrangement in which Britain could take part.
I think one might also add, of course, that other European countries had empires as well at the point where the EEC was established, and so at the time in the 1950s, it was rather seen as a process by which these countries were going to strengthen their existing relationships rather than as alternatives. So sometimes it's suggested that Britain didn't get on with the EEC because of its imperial legacy. Well, maybe true in part, but of course all these other countries, France, the Dutch and so on, even Italy had imperial legacies as well. So I think that can, although I do think there's an element of truth in that broad claim, we have to remember that there is this much broader kind of colonial perspective which has to be taken into account when thinking about the origins of the EEC. And that's often a part of the story which actually gets written out of official versions of EU history as well.
And this is especially important if you look at it from a German angle, because the Germans, of course, had lost it all in colonial terms. And for some of Germany's political elite, European integration was a way of regaining some of those colonies. And for France, it was a way of strengthening them.
We have a couple of sort of quick, I would say, historical questions here. The Benelux countries started to take steps towards economic and political union from the second half of the 1940s. Was Churchill aware of these developments, and did it have any effect on his thinking? So, Felix.
It did. Thank you for going to me, because I am from one of the Benelux countries. In his 1948 speech at The Hague, he actually alluded to the Benelux as one of the ways in which European cooperation could take shape, and one of the ways that what European countries were already doing was influencing his own thinking. And he sort of smiled inwardly as he said Benelux, and then he said that happy novel term. And then he went on speaking in The Hague. So he was definitely aware of the Benelux and very much appreciated it.
Okay, and then sort of heading back across the Atlantic and maybe picking up on a point that Richard made earlier, we have a question. How did the Eisenhower administration's view on European integration impact Churchill's thinking and actions? So, Richard?
Well, this is a very complicated question, and I wish that a scholar called Justin Quinn Olmsted were here, because he's been working on this. But I think
it may be him asking the question. We don't know. We don't have a name attached to it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, Justin, if it's you, you know the answer better than I do. But if it's not you, then I think that there was, Felix kind of mentioned the question of a European army earlier on. And sometimes it is suggested that Churchill was opposed to this sort of full stop, because he used the term sludgy amalgam to talk about a European army. But what he was talking about was a European army in which each of the divisions were sort of international rather than being composed of national divisions. So at a certain point, Churchill did favour a European army, and the Eisenhower administration really was keen to do things which would, as it saw, sort of strengthen European security. So my understanding is that there was pressure on the British and on Churchill, even when he was in opposition, to go along with that kind of military integration of Europe, which is, of course, a somewhat separate issue from the economic and trade cooperation that we've largely been talking about so far.
But it was essential to his European thinking, and it was already in some of his early notes on European unity, in some of his early articles in 1946 in December in the Telegraph. He already wrote about some common form of defense being necessary to any sort of Council of Europe being established. And Eisenhower was very much impressed with Churchill's campaign to unite Europe, and would later call it the crowning achievement of a career crowned by achievement.
Well, your references to defence allow me to come to a question which brings us back, I suppose, to the present. And this is a question about European unity in the conditions of ongoing Russian aggression against Georgia and now against the Ukraine. And the questioner says, unfortunately, not all European countries have a common position. Now, this is especially noticeable in the context of Nord Stream 2. After Brexit, Britain's unequivocal position condemning aggression only intensified, but the same cannot be said about other European countries. Can Churchill's ideas of a Europe united by common values be applied here? Can it become the ideological basis for uniting Europe against violations of international law and aggression? Felix, do you want to take that one?
Sure. It should be, but I'm not sure if it can be. It should be our values which hold us together, and it should be a European defense that is the tool to defend those values and to defend the territorial integrity of the European Union as it stands. That's my position. That's a normative position. I think it could be reality if all settles back to normal, but we're not quite there yet. Even the sort of pro-European energy of President Macron and some of the help he's gotten from Angela Merkel has not led to more than just a pragmatic and sort of slow steps towards a closer European defense. But we're nowhere close to where Churchill was thinking Europe could have been in the 1950s, when the European defense community ended in failure in 1954.
Richard, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, just an observation, really, which is that it struck me during the referendum that this idea of Europe as a sort of potential security bulwark against Russia. It wasn't something that was really came up and wasn't used. Whereas, as I've said, in the 1940s, although Churchill had to step quite carefully to try and avoid being portrayed as a warmonger, it was clearly part of his agenda. And equally, it was there during the 1960s, during the first application, that this wasn't just presented as something which was going to be of economic benefit. It was the EEC was British membership of the EEC was presented as something that would help strengthen Western Europe against Soviet aggression. And so, although I'm not necessarily saying that this line should have been used or was the right line to use, it did strike me that there was Faisal Islam, when he sort of interviewed David Cameron in front of an audience, sort of one of his first questions was, what is going to happen first, sort of economic disaster or World War III, which provoked the audience into laughter. But it did strike me as quite a flippant question, because this was just 2 years after the Russians had invaded the Crimea. And so, although I'm not saying that or activities in the Ukraine is going to trigger World War III, the idea that the EU might play some kind of important role in creating unity or solidarity in the way in which the questioner has suggested, this seemed to have forgotten about, I think, because people had started to take European peace probably far too much for granted.
Okay, so defence wasn't raised particularly in the referendum debate, but of course one thing that was raised was federalism and the increasing bureaucracy of the European Union, and of course we have questions coming in on that as well. So, you know, what would Churchill's reaction have been to a more federal Europe, a Europe that with a sort of larger bureaucracy that took power away from national governments?
Well, I mean, then we kind of get into debates about the nature of the modern EU. I mean, I think that probably I would only say that, again, this is kind of one of the aspects of modern political life which Churchill would have had difficulty understanding, because I think that there's a certain point at which it's possible to make progress in terms of economic integration simply by removing barriers. But in a way, what the creation of the single market showed was that to actually integrate economies fully, then you do need an awful lot of complex rules and regulations in order to create a level playing field. This, of course, is, strikes many people as unsatisfactory, but I think that you genuinely have to make a choice, that it's not a case that you can simply say, oh, let's have unfettered free trade and no regulations. That doesn't really work. The regulations are actually the mechanism by which free trade comes to be functional. And so I'm sort of getting into politics now, but I think that Churchill would have been quite surprised, and I'm sure he would have had some scathing things to say about various European regulations. I'm sure we can imagine the kinds of things that he might have said about them. But in a way, the way in which the world had moved by 2016 was simply much more complex in various ways. All sorts of institutional changes, which I'm sure that sort of Churchill as a young, we always think, which Churchill? What would Churchill have thought if he'd turned up in 2016? Well, he might have thought very differently if we kind of took the young Churchill and planted him there versus the middle-aged Churchill versus the old Churchill. So, which one do you want, really?
And one thing to say about him, which I think goes for all Churchills, young, middle-aged, and old, is that he lived in the realm of fact-based politics. And the EU is one of the most effective bureaucracies in the world, very nimble. Not a lot of people work in Brussels. The EU bureaucracy is the size of about a mid-sized Dutch city, and still it serves nearly 500 million people. So I just wanted to add that to Richard's very good point about the need for regulation in order to maintain a single market.
Okay, well, I think we've more or less come full circle. So I think we can end perhaps by getting you to answer what was the very first question to come to me through the chat. The question is simply this: when Churchill said of Europe, "We are with but not of," what did he mean?
Well, again, I think that in the context of 1930, so this takes us back to his 1930 article, which you were talking about earlier, Alan. And I suppose that what's interesting about that is that he is kind of reacting to this sort of concrete proposal, the so-called Briand Plan, and that he was much more enthusiastic about it than most British politicians were, actually. So although he kind of uses this saving phrase about "we are with and not of," I think that in a way, by saying "we are with," he was actually going further than some British politicians would have been prepared to say at the time. So I think that in simple terms, what he probably meant at this point is that he wasn't advocating for that particular scheme at that particular moment, that Britain should be a part of it. I think that's probably quite unequivocal. But I think that also, if you sort of look at the broader view that he had of European civilization, then he did think that, you know, perhaps certainly mainland Europe was distinct in certain ways from Britain, but he also did think that there was an underlying culture which, as far as he was concerned, was based on Judeo-Christian values and the inheritance of Greece and Rome. I think he did think that these were things which the whole of Europe, including Britain, had in common. So I don't think that he saw Britain as being absolutely and totally culturally distinct from mainland Europe.
And Felix?
I would say no continental politician at the time or now would probably say that they are of Europe. They are not property of Europe. They are with or in Europe. And that was what counted for Churchill. So I fully support what Richard just said there. One point I'd like to make is that he was, at this point when he wrote this in 1930, straddling this great divide. We've been returning to this idea of where he thought British power should derive from. He was with Europe because he thought it would probably deliver Britain extra power and secure peace and prosperity for all. He was with the United States because it was probably a way to secure more power for Britain and bring prosperity to the world. And he was with the Commonwealth because he believed all those same things about the Commonwealth and empire as well. So we shouldn't make too much of the prepositions. We should look at his worldview and we should look at what he said. And it was consistently pro-building and anti-breaking.
I think that's an excellent note on which to end. Thank you both for being prepared to cover so much ground, and my apologies to those people whose questions we didn't reach this evening. And I'm going to hand back now to Shirley for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Alan. And on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, and indeed all of us today, a huge thank you to you, Richard, and to you, Felix, for a really stimulating discussion and for bringing a great deal of nuance and historical context to this very complex and obviously still highly charged topic. As promised, we're giving away a copy of Felix's book, Churchill on Europe, and also a copy of Richard's book, Winston Churchill, A Life in the News, for the two best questions we received. We had almost 50 questions, and there wasn't, sadly, the opportunity to pose all of them to our panelists, but we did consider all of them for the prizes, and I'm delighted to announce that our winners today are Jeffrey Patterson and Ho Yong Lok. We'll be in touch with both of you to arrange getting those books to you. And a reminder that if you'd like to buy a copy of Richard or Felix's books, please do follow the links that Justin put in the chat earlier. Before we finish, I just want to thank again the International Churchill Society and the Churchill Archives Centre for partnering with the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre to present this event. Thank you, Alan, as always, for your wonderful work as moderator and chair. Also, thanks again to Justin Reish and to Kat Lee, who have made sure that everything behind the scenes operated as seamlessly as possible for all of us today. Thank you both. Please do take a look at what's on at the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre over the next few weeks. We have a talk from the Chief Curator of the Imperial War Museum's Holocaust exhibition, who will tell us about why and how the exhibition is being completely revamped. And we have a number of other short courses and other fantastic courses on and talks. I also want to remind you of the final event in our Sir Martin Gilbert Churchill Conversation series, in which Alan will be in conversation with Lord Dobbs, Michael Dobbs, to discuss Churchill's legacy on stage and screen. That'll be in 2 weeks' time, on the 27th of April, again at 5 p.m. UK time, and we will have another book giveaway. So please do register to book your place. Otherwise, thank you all again for joining us. Hope to see you again soon, and wishing you all a very pleasant morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. See you soon.